Hello. It's lovely to see you. I'm hoping to be in a position. I'm Malcolm, by the way. I lead the church here at Gold Hill. Thanks for coming. And thanks for joining us online. If you are joining us online, it's really kind of you. And I trust you know God's peace. We've been in the process of looking for a youth worker for a little while. I can't tell you who that person is yet, but I can tell you that we've made an appointment. That was kind of excited, but never mind. We're really excited about that. I want that person to be able to tell some folk that they're connected to this week, and I want to be able to talk to our youth workers and children's workers about that this week, but we should be in a position next week to tell you about that. It's great news. I'm very excited about it. I think that they're going to bring a real blessing to our youth work and really strengthen them. Now, don't normally do this, but you know that a couple of weeks ago I introduced you to young Sam Dallimore, who is a student from Morelands with us for 5 weeks. Some of you were present then. A lot of our folk are away this morning for Mother's Day celebrations. Well, Sam Dallimore, I first met him when he was 2. And I met his mum and dad then too, and they were part of the congregation that I led in Bournemouth. And they're here. Simon and Sue Dallimore are here this morning. Would you like to welcome them? They're just checking to make sure that you're kosher. They want to make sure that they haven't sent their son into some kind of really odd church family. So do say hello to them afterwards and welcome them and get to know them a little bit. I saw my mum yesterday. Yes, thank you, Hilary. That's very kind of you. It was lovely to see her because she's been really unwell for a long time, as you know. And yesterday, she was looking much brighter. She'd had her hair done. She had a conversation with me, which was really special. And I was glad to be in Ireland for the day, even though I got back a little bit tired afterwards. And it was lovely to see her. But, you know, my mum has heard me preach 3 or 4 times, Debbie, in the nearly 30 years that I've been preaching. And when she's in the room, it changes everything. I always get nervous when I preach. Always have done. Always feel, oh, Lord, if you don't speak, this is going to be a bit of a disaster. Doesn't matter whether I speak to 2 people or the biggest crowd I've spoken to is about 300,000. I'm always nervous, and I always feel the same nerves. But when my mum's in the room, because, I mean, she knows me. She knows everything about me. Well, she doesn't now, but she has for a long time known everything about me. And one look from your mother can make the strongest, most confident preacher into a withering wreck. And I think the passage that we're going to look at this morning as we continue our journey through Mark's gospel, I sometimes wonder if Mary was listening to Jesus preaching, what did Jesus feel? If you've got a Bible with you, could you please look at Mark chapter 6? We're going to read verses 1 to 6 and then make some comments on it as we continue our journey through the book of Mark this year under the title, Jesus at the Center of It All. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been exploring the reasons that people said no to Jesus in Mark's gospel. They said no to him because he broke the rules. They said no to him because they thought he was either mad or a blasphemer. And this week, as we look at this passage, we're going to explore that some people said no to Jesus because they thought he was just a man. Let's read together Mark chapter 6, verses 1 to 6. Jesus left that place and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. On the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who had heard him were astounded. They said, "Where did this man get all of this? What is this wisdom that has been given to him? What deeds of power are being done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. Then Jesus said to them, "Prophets are not without honor except in their hometown and among their own kin and in their own house." And he could do no deed of power there except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them. And he was amazed at their unbelief. Amen. God always blesses the public reading of his inspired and his infallible word. We've explored who Jesus is. We've explored his power to forgive sins, his power to overcome demons, his power over creation, his power over the church, his power over life. And over the last few weeks, we've been exploring the reasons that people said no to Jesus. And here in this passage, if you read it, it's obvious, but it's really quite odd. Because Jesus, as he turns up in his hometown, we're told in Luke 4 that he was there about a year before, and they rejected him then too. So he goes back to his hometown. Verse 1 tells us that. They knew him. This was Jesus, Joseph's boy. Jesus that made a really good table. Jesus that used to play with my daughter Rebecca. This is Jesus who lived next door, and they could be quite a rowdy family because there were quite a lot of them. This is Jesus, Simon's big brother, and Joseph's big brother, and Judas's big brother. This is Jesus, the homeboy made good. This is Jesus who's come back. So he turns up, and he's preaching and teaching, and they've heard about him. And as you read the narrative, something really interesting happens. It says that they were astounded at his teaching. They were taken aback by him. They thought, "What? This is incredible." And then it begins to change. It seems to be a bit odd to me. Because as Jesus is speaking, they're clearly impacted. And then they say, "Hold on a minute. Isn't this Jesus, Mary's boy? Isn't this Jesus, the carpenter? Isn't this just Jesus?" And then they take offense at him. And then they reject him. It's not the way you think the story's going to go when you read the opening words, because the opening words are so powerful and so positive and so affirming, and you think, I can see where this is going, and then it takes a right turn and goes downhill. They rejected him. And fundamentally, in Mark chapter 6, verses 1 to 6, the people of Nazareth rejected Jesus because he was just Jesus. He wasn't special. They rejected him because he was a man. There are lessons in there for us, and I want to unpack some of them. But let me start by reading to you something that many of you will be familiar with. It's from C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, another Irishman who became a Christian reluctantly. He described himself as the most reluctant convert in England. And then he became one of the greatest explainers or defenders of the Christian faith in the 20th century. The posh word for that is an apologist. And he said this, "I am trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about Jesus. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I do not accept his claim to be God. That's the one thing that we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sorts of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool. You can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that option open to us. He did not intend to." So, as we read Mark chapter 6, verses 1 to 6, let's explore just a few lessons, and then we can draw some conclusions for ourselves. Is that all right? And then you can all get home for a lovely Sunday lunch. First of all, these people had another encounter, another opportunity to encounter Jesus. In verse 1, we're told that he came to his homeland. I'll comment on that in a moment. But in verse 2, we're told that on the Sabbath day, he came into the synagogue and he started to teach them. And as they listened to him, they asked two questions and made one observation. Question 1, where did this man get all this? Question 2, what is this wisdom that has been given to him? And the observation or the exclamation, what deeds of power are being done by his hands? So, they absolutely knew that they were receiving something fundamentally different about the kingdom of God. This Jesus didn't sound like the other teachers. He didn't sound like the scribes. He didn't sound like the religious people. When he spoke wisdom. People listened. They were changed. They were impacted. They were transformed. And he didn't just speak. He did things. He did deeds of power. And they knew about that. They had an opportunity to have an encounter with Jesus Christ. They knew that this was quite unlike anything that they'd ever heard before. In fact, in another part of the Bible, in the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, at the end of the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount, the scriptures say this, and they were astounded at his authority, because he did not teach like the scribes and the Pharisees. That's what's happening in this story. They're saying, he is incredible. That's how it starts. But then, as they listened, they thought, where does this come from? What is this that he is saying? What are these deeds? They're amazing. When you encounter Jesus Christ, when anyone encounters Jesus Christ, there is another worldliness about him. The church isn't quite so popular as Jesus. I think that's the right way round, by the way. Jesus is magnetic. He's like a massive magnet that attracts iron filings. He is intriguing. He is captivating. The old word that people used to use about him is that he is winsome. He is alluring. He draws you in. And in those two questions, in that statement that these guys, these folk in the town that he's from make about him, we see something that is principally a lesson for us about how anybody encounters Jesus. He's got another worldliness about him. And there's a depth of wisdom about Jesus. When you really hear what he says, it really makes sense. He speaks into the very deepest areas of our lives in a way that preachers often don't, actually. And services often don't. But Jesus knows us. And he can speak into our hearts and say something that can deeply change us. And he does things. He demonstrates what life really looks like. These people knew that Jesus was a healer. They knew that he was a deliverer. They knew that he had done miracles. They'd heard that he'd walked on, that he had calmed a storm. They heard all of that. They knew about him, and they were intrigued by him. But here's the second lesson. If an encounter with Jesus is intriguing and captivating and draws you in, then here's the second thing. Overfamiliarity with Jesus can breed contempt. You can get so used to him that the mystery of him becomes mundane. And that's a dangerous place. In verse 3, we read that they say, isn't this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon, and aren't his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. They thought they knew him because they'd spent a lot of time with him. They'd watched him grow up. They'd spent 30-odd years with him. As I said in my introductory comments, they probably have bits of furniture in their house made by him. They knew Mary, and they knew Joseph, and they knew his family. And therefore they assumed that they knew Jesus, except they didn't really know Jesus. The interesting thing about this mini-series, if I can pause for a moment, I keep forgetting to say this, so I want to say it now while it's in my head. There were lots of reasons that people said no to Jesus, as we've already said. They said no to him because they thought that he broke the rules. They said no to him because they thought he was either out of his mind or a blasphemer. We're going to look today, we're looking at the fact that they said no to him because they thought he was just a man. If any of those things were true, then they should have said no to him. If it was that he was just a lawbreaker, then they were right to say no to him. If it was that he was just kind of odd, that he wasn't quite right, and that he kind of exaggerated his position, then they should have said no to him. And if he was just a man, then he was an imposter. So all of the opposition, all of the reasons for rejecting Jesus were valid reasons if he was a liar, if he wasn't who he claimed to be. But if he really was who he claimed to be, then none of those objections stand. And that's still the same today. People say, I'm rejecting Jesus because he's just a man. Well, if he's just a man, you should reject him because he's a liar. I'm rejecting Jesus because he's not alive. Well, if he's not alive, you should reject him. I'm rejecting Jesus because he's a misrepresentation of God. Well, if he is a misrepresentation of God, you should reject him. But if he's not a liar, and if he is alive, and if he does represent God to us, then you've got to be willing to think about that, right? Or is your position already settled and you're looking for reasons to reject him? Some of the reasons that people want to reject Jesus are good reasons. What we have to do is help people understand that the reasons that they have for rejecting Jesus aren't good because they're not true. Does that make sense? But this group of people were familiar with him. They knew his hometown. They defined him by his earthly role. He's a carpenter. He couldn't be a good preacher. He's a carpenter. He couldn't be sent from God. We knew his mum. He couldn't be special because we saw him grow up. So they allowed what they thought they knew about Jesus to cause them to reject him. Worse than that, actually, we're told in verse 3 that they took offense at him. They were offended. What were they offended at? You know, those of you that are Christians, that offense can either be given or taken. If you set out to offend somebody, then you're in the wrong. And if you set out to take offense at somebody, then you're in the wrong. But if somebody tries to do something genuinely from a good heart, and you take offense at them because you don't like what they're doing, then you're the one that's in the wrong. So many family conflicts that I deal with, so many situations I deal with. And it's people who take offense while somebody's trying to sort something out. Or people who set out to offend. Why were these people offended at Jesus? They were offended because they couldn't match his wise words, his lifestyle, and his power with their limited understanding of who he is. They had a moment in which they could have allowed their understanding of him to be expanded, but instead of allowing their understanding and their history with Jesus to be expanded, instead they reduced their expectation of him to fit with what they already knew. They didn't give him a chance to prove who he was. They were overfamiliar. How familiar are you with Jesus? How long have you been a Christian? Some of us have been Christians a long time. And is it possible that we're now going through the motions of church? That we started this journey with exactly the same sense of allure and magnetism and being drawn by Christ when he spoke. And as we listened to him, we thought, there's wisdom in these words. There's power in these words. This man has changed me. And now, well, we'll fit him in. We've become too familiar with him. We've turned him into somebody that, well, if we have time, we'll give him an hour on a Sunday morning. That's a very dangerous position to be in. Is it possible that churches can be like that? Is it possible that Christians can be like that? I know lots and lots of Christians. You wouldn't be surprised by that. And I know more than you would be expecting who gave up on Jesus a long time ago. Some of you are sitting here. You come to church, but you gave up on Jesus a long time ago. You've become too familiar with him. You don't love him. He doesn't move your heart. That's why church is such a chore, because you're trying to fit him in. And he's not quite as important as your children, or your husband, or your wife. You'll give him time, or your mother, or your father, but you don't want him to be at the very center. But here's the thing, I could take two views on that. One view is to say, well, what are you doing here? And to be quite condemnatory. The other is to say, so what keeps you coming to church then? Well done for keeping at it. Well done that in the midst of your doubts, your questions, and your overfamiliarity, you're still connected. Because as long as you're connected, there's a space for God to do something. What Jan said as she opened in worship this morning, some of you are here ready to worship God, some of you aren't. Wherever you are, God is ready to meet you. Have you ever been in that place where you're thinking, I really don't get Christianity. I really don't get Jesus. I really don't understand everything. I don't understand this. I don't understand this. I'm not sure about this. I'm not sure about this. And yet you don't give up. You still plug in. You still try to work it out. Thank God you're doing that. But allow Jesus to break through your familiarity with him today and to bring you a fresh picture, a fresh revelation of who he is and what he can do. You see, Jesus is always going to be a controversial character. In the last couple of years, there are two particular books I've read about Jesus that have been incredibly powerful to me. The best books that I've read about Jesus. They are originally entitled Jesus of Nazareth, so they're not complicated titles. One looks at his ministry from his baptism all the way through to his transfiguration. And the other looks at the last 7 days of his life. They're amazing books. You should really grab them if you're interested in kind of exploring Jesus. By the way, they're by Pope Benedict XVI, so some of you would feel nervous about that. But don't, because they're really good books. And in one of the books, here's what he says. He says two things about Jesus which are really interesting. Do you remember the story of Nathanael being called by Jesus to follow him, those of you that know your Bible? Those of you that don't, Nathanael was one of the followers of Jesus, and Jesus called him, and Nathanael was sitting under a tree, and when he heard Jesus calling him, he said, huh? This is a slightly elaborated Irish version. Huh? Does anything good come from Nazareth? Completely dismissive of Jesus. The second image that Pope Benedict XVI takes is when the devil tempts Jesus in the wilderness. His first temptation of Jesus is this: turn these stones into bread. And here's what Pope Benedict XVI says about that. That first thing, Nathanael being called, and he turns and he says, huh? Can anything good come from Nazareth? That's still what people say about Jesus. And it's still what people say about the church. Huh? Can anything good come from those? Bunch of losers, bunch of nobodies, bunch of has-beens. Have you never heard this when you've tried to talk to somebody about Christianity and they say, Christianity, all Christianity is a crutch? Nobody ever heard that said to them? I'm the only one. Must be something about my faith then. I tend to say back to people when they say that to me, well, no, Christianity isn't my crutch, it's my life support machine. It's much more than a crutch. But this dismissing of Jesus and dismissing of Christians, because how can anything possibly good come from them? They're just people, and they're broken and flawed and cracked and useless. And our response should be the same as Jesus's was to Nathanael. I'll leave you to read that. To engage and to have conversation and to open ourselves up. And when Satan said to Jesus, turn these stones into bread, Jesus said, no. The world still says to the church, all we want from you is that you feed the poor. We don't want the truth. We don't want your preaching. We don't want your worship. We don't want your spirituality. We don't want your Jesus uniqueness. We don't want your allegiance to God. All we want you to be is a glorified social service. And thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of churches across the United Kingdom say, absolutely, that's fine. That's what we'll give you. That's the wrong answer. We need to be as powerfully clear as Jesus was, which is, man will not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Are we a social service in this church? Absolutely. Are we just government with a small g and done cheaper? Absolutely not. And we never will be. The reason we do what we do is because we believe Jesus is who he said he was. He is the life of God demonstrated to people. Does that make sense? And we can allow ourselves to become so familiar with him that we just kind of take him for granted. We forget. We end up seeing Jesus as just another example or just a man. And here's the thing from verse 4. Then Jesus said to them, prophets are not without honor except in their hometown and amongst their own kin and in their own house. Jesus knew their reaction to him. He knew that they were rejecting him. He knew that they weren't interested. He knew that because of their closeness of geography, because he was related to some of them, and because some of them knew him really well, they wouldn't accept who he was. Of course, there was no dichotomy between Jesus' public ministry and life and private life. So when he stood in the synagogue to talk, and his mum was there, he was never thinking, oh my goodness, she knows everything about me. This is going to be a bad moment. Whereas when I preach and my mum has been there, I think, oh my goodness, she knows everything about me. This could be a bad moment. And Jesus knows what you think about him too. He knows exactly what we think about him. He knows exactly where we are at with him. And I wish it were not so, but you can fool everybody else. You can fool me. You can fool your husband, your wife, your children, your leaders, your family. You can even fool yourself. But you can't fool him. He knows exactly what you think about him today. And he doesn't condemn you. He wants to meet you in that place and help you to acknowledge his greatness and his power and to go beyond familiarity. The challenge of our faith is to live it out where we are fully known. Francis Chan, an American pastor, said this in one of his books: the irony is this, that while God doesn't need us but still wants us, we desperately need God, but we don't really want him most of the time. We'll read it again, because some of you are saying, pardon? The irony is that while God doesn't need us, but still wants us, we desperately need God, but we don't really want him most of the time. He knows that, and is incredibly patient with us. Do you remember the story of Jesus' birth? When Mary and Joseph arrive in Bethlehem trying to find somewhere to stay. And they turn up at the Bethlehem Hilton, and it's closed, overbooked, and they make their way down to a grubby little inn. And the innkeeper says, there's no room here, out the back. Each of us, I think, is an innkeeper who decides in our hearts whether there is room for Jesus in our lives or not. Is there room for Jesus in your life? I can't answer that question for you. But I hope you answer it with a yes. So, as a result of their confusion, as a result of their looking at his earthly life, as a result of them knowing him, but not really knowing him, they reject him. And their rejection limits his authority. It limits his ability to do stuff where they live. Look at verse 5. It's really interesting. And he could do no deed of power there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them. So in the New Testament, in the book of Mark, he didn't do very much. It wasn't that impressive. He just cured some people. If Jesus was to put his hand on a few sick people and make them well here, would we say he didn't do very much? Or would we be saying, he's on the move? But here, in the words of Mark, Peter, who tells this story, and Mark writes it down, says he couldn't do very much because their lack of belief in him limited them. So, church family, Gold Hill, for a moment, if you're looking online, Gold Hill family, I want to ask you a question. Are we limiting God? Are we one of the reasons that we don't see God moving as often because we're limiting him? Don't blame it on everybody else. Are we limiting him? Do we need a fresh encounter with him? And if you're not part of the Gold Hill family and you're part of another church, are you limiting God? Have you become so familiar with him that you don't expect anything from him anymore? I hope not. Corrie ten Boom once said this. She lived in a concentration camp with her sister Betsy. And her Betsy died just before the end of the Second World War. Corrie became an amazing woman used by God as she shared the story of forgiveness and grace. And in one of her books, she said this: is prayer your steering wheel, or is it your spare wheel? The answer to that question will tell you the extent to which we are depending on or not God. Is prayer our steering wheel, or is it our spare wheel? So what are the lessons for you and for me on the 6th of March? Well, it's Mother's Day. What's that got to do with this passage? Mothering Sunday isn't actually primarily about mothers. And it's not primarily about women. Mothering Sunday is the middle Sunday in Lent. And on Mothering Sunday in Lent, each year for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, Christians returned to their mother church, the church where they were baptized. And they remembered their commitments to Jesus. And they examined their lives and looked back over the last 12 months and said, how am I doing? And they recommitted their purpose and their life to Jesus. Why? So that they didn't get overfamiliar. So let's do Mother's Day as Mothering Sunday. If you've been baptized, if you're a Christian, if you have a mother church, how are you and Jesus doing? Give yourself a moment to ask, have I got over familiar with him? Has everything just got a bit samey? Do I need to be enlivened again? Have a bit of fresh energy and life about me? Am I willing to be shaken a little? And am I willing to look at Jesus again in a fresh and in a new light? The big issue at the heart of this story was that they were rejecting Jesus because they thought he was a man. He's just Jesus. And of course, we know that the New Testament doesn't teach that. We've already looked at Mark, at the fact that he has authority over sins, demons, nature, and sickness. In Mark 2, Jesus forgives sins. Jews knew only God could do that. In Matthew chapter 2, 14, 28, and in John chapter 9, Jesus accepted worship. Jews knew only God could do that. In John 14, 15, 16, and 17, just before he was murdered, he spoke to his disciples about God in the most personal of ways. He used the word Father or Abba, which does not mean daddy. It means papa. There's a deep respect in it. He used it again and again and again in a way that Jews knew this is new. He is saying something about who he is that is challenging every religious core that we have. In John, he kept using this phrase, I am. That's the name of God. In John 6, he said, I am the bread of life. In John 8, he said, I am the light of the world. In John 10, he said two things, I am the gate and I am the good shepherd. In John 11, he said, I am the resurrection and the life. In John 14, he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And in John 15, he said, I am the vine. And in John 8, he said, before Abraham was, I am. Direct claims at being God. Not only that, but in John 18, when Jesus was arrested and he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, the soldiers came to arrest him and they asked, where is Jesus? And in your Bibles, in verses 4, 5, and 6, 4 or 5 times, Jesus responds by saying, I am he. In the original language, the pronoun he isn't there. As far as I can tell, those 3 verses contain the most densely packed demonstration of the use of the Yahweh name in the whole of the Bible. 4 or 5 times in the space of a few moments, Jesus says to these people coming to arrest him, I am, I am, I am, I am, I am. His words were so powerful that John 18 says that the soldiers that came to arrest him were knocked off their feet and landed on their backs as a result of it. He claimed to be the Messiah. He spoke to a woman and he said to her, I am the Messiah. I am, in John chapter 4, the one for whom you are yearning and longing. The New Testament is packed full of a high vision of Jesus Christ. He is the visible expression of the invisible God, Paul says to the Colossians church. And he says that in him the fullness of God dwells in bodily form. When John is trying to explain Jesus in his opening remarks, he says this, and the Word became flesh and blood and dwelt amongst us, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father. It's incredible. I guess it's all right. He's making this direct, powerful claim at divinity. Is that the Jesus that you know? Or because we use his name so often and sing so many songs and come to so many services, have we turned the Son of God into just a man? Is he too familiar? Is there space in you and me for God to move? Are we willing to share Jesus in our hometown and our family? Are we too familiar with him? How do we respond to the idea that Jesus knows exactly how we feel about him? Are we limiting God in our own lives or in our churches or in our culture because we're embarrassed by him? Here's the great thing about the end of this story, by the way. They reject him. And he says, well, I can't do anything here. But in verse 6, we're told that he went about the other villages and he continued to preach and teach. You do know, don't you, that your denial or acceptance of Jesus doesn't change who he is one bit. We can sometimes say, well, he's not God because I say he's not God. Actually, he's still God. And he's not going to move because I say he can't move. No, he'll just move without you. Don't ever assume that Gold Hill Baptist Church is the only church that God can use in South Buckinghamshire. Like that, he can raise up another church. Like that, he could send another community to this village. Like that. And if we keep saying, no, we're not sure, no, we're a bit familiar, no, we'd like things to stay the way they are, God will say, okay, eventually, no problem, I'll just do it without you. We assume that God will always, always, always put up with our indifference toward him. And the reality is that he won't. He's still God. So as we think today about him, let's respond to him. Let's allow his lordship to flood our lives again. Let's be honest about that. Kevin Max said this in one of his books. The greatest single cause of atheism in the world today is Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips, walk out the door and deny him by their lifestyle. This is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable. Acknowledge him as Lord and God and give him some space. Amen. Lots of people struggle with Mother's Day. I do a little bit. Some people struggle with Mother's Day because they're not mothers. Or because they were once. I think mothers always deserve respect and love, especially those that have had to give their children back. Some people struggle with Mother's Day because they wanted to become a mother and never got the chance. Some because their mothers are gone, or are going, or are cruel. But here's the thing about the church. Every single woman here in this building and listening via the internet, if only we could grasp this, every single one of you can be a mother in Israel. This church family needs you all to be mothers. But I've never carried a child. then carry one spiritually. Love somebody else. Imagine how gay people would feel, or single people would feel, or divorced people would feel if we got this right. And the church was a genuine family where everyone had a role to play, where everyone did the fathering and the loving and the welcoming and the mothering. Imagine the impact. And instead of us spending our lives saying, I'm sad because I didn't get this, and I didn't get this, and I didn't get this, and I didn't get this. Imagine what would happen if instead every woman here today said, whether I ever bear a child myself or not, I can be a mother to somebody. I can love someone. I can welcome them. I can hold them. I can pray for them. I can support them. I can nurture them. And imagine the impact that your mothering could have on people sitting here who had mothers who were terrible mothers, or lost their mum at an early age and desperately need to know the love of a mother. And you could be that person. Your arms, your home, your words could transform for somebody who's never had a good experience of love. God's gracious love and compassion. So on a Mothering Sunday, not only do we return to the promises that we made, but we remember that each of us can take our place in the family of God. Each of us can play a part.